Welcome to another edition of Focus, a program designed to inform and connect the communities of Storm Lake, Alta, Lakeside, and Buena Vista University. I'm Mandi Meyer, your host for Focus. During the show, we will talk to local leaders about issues, projects, and events that affect you. Today, we are focusing on Buena Vista University's history of the 1960s class and how that class is remembering the events that occurred on the Kent State campus in Ohio on May 4th, 1970. Most people associate Kent State with this famous picture of students reaching in horror to the events that took place on that day. Earlier this week's Focus Brian Rubis met with Assistant Professor of History, Dr. Bill Feis, to talk about the history of the 60s and how his class is remembering Kent State.
Thanks for being with us today, Dr. Feis, on a day much like it was in 1970 at Kent State when the riots occurred on that campus. Perhaps you could tell us why you're teaching a class about the 1960s here at BVU.
Well, I thought that doing a class on the 1960s was really essential in looking at modern American history. The 60s was just a pivotal decade in modern history since 1945. And I think students respond to it because it's mostly about students and activism.
What are some of the significance of the 1960s?
The 60s for America was a tremendously important decade. It was one of those decades where we remember what happened and people remember where they were and what they were doing. And plus the large number of people of the baby boom generation that lived through the 1960s, they have long memories and we tend to focus on them. And they focus on the 60s as a defining experience, not only in their own lives, but in the life of the United States, because so much happened. The civil rights movement, Vietnam, ending with the Watergate fiasco in the early 70s, that we had a decade which really transformed us and how we live right now.
Indeed, pivotal. What mistaken impressions do you think that people have about the 1960s?
That it was all about hippies and drugs and sex and rock and roll. There was a lot of that, but it was also a tremendously idealistic decade in which students and other people from all walks of life found it within themselves to bring about significant change in the United States, whether it be in race relations, poverty, and getting rid of poverty, or just trying to change the values of America. It was a tremendously important time that I think we needed to have as a country by that time.
How do the 1960s and the student movement affect students today?
Well, some would argue not at all, but I think students are a tremendously important group, and the more kids on campus these days, they become a very important voice out there. They're in an educational setting, just like students in the 60s were, and they are challenging their minds, their ideas, their values, and at that time is when they're the most potent and ready to question their society and perhaps those beliefs. And I think we're very similar to the 1960s. Anytime you have a lot of students on campus, there's that potential. So I don't necessarily think that this generation is less ambitious or less active than the 60s generation. I think they could be, were the right issues to arrive in front of them.
What are some of the similarities between today and the 1960s?
I think in looking at students and having taught enough students in the 1990s, that I think there's a lot of similarities as far as students' idealism. They come with a certain amount of wanting to see a better world. That's why they're in college, to improve their own lives. But they also, I think, see that the possibility is really there to go beyond improving their own lives, but also to work to improve the lives of others. And I think that is there, and it was there in the 60s. I do not think that is gone. It's just finding the right voices coming together at the right time.
More of a shifting than a changing.
Yeah.
Basically, can you go into what happened at Kent State and possibly, where it's located and things of that nature?
Certainly. Kent State is in Kent, Ohio, and it's a medium-sized university, a state school in the state of Ohio. And it was a very active place in the late 1960s in the anti-war movement. Students there of all colors and stripes would gather and protest the war. After 1968, there was not as much activity there because we were withdrawing from Vietnam very, very slowly. But in 1970, it was announced, President Nixon came on TV and told the world that not only that we were not really withdrawing like he said, although we were, but he had actually increased or widened the war by sending American troops into Cambodia, which is east or west, excuse me, of South Vietnam. And in doing that, widening the war, many people, students, believed they'd been lied to, and they reacted by coming out and protesting the government's widening of this war. Nixon had already lied about bombing Cambodia. He'd said we didn't, but we did. And so students were through, I believe, with it. And so they had a protest on May 3rd, the night of May 3rd. Students got out of hand a little bit, but it was students and also people from the community came on campus and burned the Reserve Officer Training Corps building. May 4th, there was a rally planned. The president of the university had banned it. The governor had called out the National Guard to the campus. And on May 4th, they went ahead with the rally that was banned. And the guardsmen came with bayonets and loaded rifles. And it ended up, we don't know how yet, it's really inconclusive, but in the end, 28 guardsmen in a barrage of fire that lasted about 60 seconds, excuse me, killed 4 students and wounded about 9 others.
What is the significance of what actually happened there?
I think from a student perspective, it's tremendously important even for students today. These students, some of them some of those that were killed were merely walking to class. I imagine, as students do every day, listening to the bells as they walk to class. Many students were doing the same thing and found themselves in a line of fire from their own state under the orders of an elected governor. And I think for students, it's tremendously important to remember that their voices were trying to be heard. They were protesting the actions of their government, and their government didn't want to listen and in fact sent force to suppress it. The thing that I find most chilling about Kent State was that most of the American public when polled believed that forcible repression of student activism on campus and demonstrations was okay, even if it meant killing students.
How did the events of Kent State affect policy today?
On campuses, I think campuses are much wiser about student demonstrations and looking how to handle them more peacefully. I don't know as far as a national policy what kind of impact it had, but certainly colleges stood up and took notice. After Kent State, most colleges across the nation called off classes, had finals and held them off till fall, or just called off classes altogether to avoid another Kent State incident. So in the meantime, since then, campuses and administrations have looked into how to avoid coming to that impasse between students and National Guardsmen with loaded rifles. They've found other ways, and some are more successful than others to avoid that kind of demonstration. But having National Guardsmen on campus with loaded rifles was deemed to be a mistake, big mistake.
Perhaps shifting gears a little bit, what is the Kent State commemorative, and why are you and your students involved with it?
I thought it would be really nice as part of a class on the 60s, since it's really a class about young people changing the world, that we should look and commemorate an event in our history in which students were attempting to do that and were gunned down by their government. And I think it's really important that we look at that and study it and commemorate that event, especially since it involves students and young people all of your age who died, some of them just walking to class, but some also just expressing their discontent with their government, which was our right to do. And I think that is something that is worth marking as an occasion for as long as there are universities and as long as there are students.
Indeed. Why is it important for students to remember Kent State on a day like today?
Well, on a beautiful day like today, on May 4th, and what many people, the twin sister of Kent State, was 10 days after Kent State at Jackson State in Mississippi, a similar incident happened and 2 students were killed. So between Kent State and Jackson State, on a beautiful day like today in both places, students, I think it is important to take a moment and think about those students their age whose lives were cut short for expressing their beliefs, and some of them just merely walking to class.
What was the response to what happened at Kent State from other colleges around the country?
Some called off classes, many had exams early, and we found that some colleges just literally in Ohio, in fact Ohio State University, they had gates on the campus going in, and they just closed the gates, and you couldn't get on campus, and the National Guard was there cordoning it off, and basically you took your exams. If you had exams, professors managed to get apartments of students where they would have the exams because no students were allowed on campus. They wanted to avoid any kind of post-Kent State violence, and many colleges did not reconvene until the fall. But by that time, passions had cooled a bit, and students came back to campus, and the war was truly winding down. So the anti-war movement, that was really the peak of it, and it began to wind down after that.
Why should students here at BVU and other universities and colleges be concerned about what happened?
Again, I think it's really the essence of free speech and students on campus. This is a tremendously intellectual atmosphere where students are learning about all sorts of different things that are challenging their beliefs, challenging their ideas, and helping create new ones. And this is an environment in which those should be expressed. And in the 60s, many student activists realized that the university had to be the core of any kind of social change in the United States because it was the youthful generation equipped with an education that could truly change the world. And so in thinking about what had happened at Kent State, at Jackson State, that is for us to remember that we should not take too lightly that obligation to question, because an educated person has a responsibility to question his or her society and to change it if necessary.
Perhaps you could go into a little bit of why was Kent State considered possibly a powder keg, if you will, as opposed to some other university?
Well, I can give you an example of a university that was not a powder keg. One was Buena Vista University and University of Nebraska, where I did my undergraduate work. Those were two places that there was not much activity like that. In fact, at the University of Nebraska in 1972, Richard Nixon came to campus, and it was deemed that was the only campus he was safe to go on without being protested, and he was safe. He was not protested. But the campus environment and the comparisons are there between a Kent State and a BVU, and that you have a place where people meet to be educated, and they find compatriots in causes, and I think it's very important that students do find those compatriots, and we do challenge what people do think.
Thanks for joining us today, Dr. Feis, as we look back and remember Kent State and how it affects us today.
Thank you for having me.
Once again, the History of the 60s class will be remembering the 32nd anniversary of the events at Kent State on May 4th. When we come back, we will be focusing on Buena Vista University student Rebecca Bray, who was actually at Kent State during the time of the protests. We'll be back right after this.
Life is like a race. Sometimes you win, and sometimes it seems everything is against you. When it feels like you're losing the race, the Girls in Boys Town National Hotline can give you the tools and confidence to get back on track. Just call 1-800-448-3000. Any problem, anytime. We're here for you. The Girls in Boys Town National Hotline.
What is a hero? Are heroes born, or are they made? In after-school programs, your kids will uncover hidden strengths, discover they have the power to change their future, and find the hero inside themselves. Let us know you on after-school programs in your area. Call 1-800-USA-LEARN. After-school programs, helping kids find the hero within.
to another edition of Focus.
Welcome to Beaver Football Weekly, another episode.
Welcome back. Earlier, I met with Buena Vista University student Rebecca Bray, who was at the Kent State campus during the events that took place on May 4th. Rebecca, thank you so much for taking time out to speak with us. First of all, what was it like at Kent State at the time of the incident that happened? Kind of the atmosphere, what was going on at Kent State itself?
There was a lot of drinking, unfortunately, more than what the publicity was even allowed to say. There was a lot of misinformation, I think, too. People really were not organized enough, trying to put forth a purpose of really being able to speak and say what we were against. And that didn't come across. What really came across was a rowdy bunch of kids that were drunk and violent, and that's not what was intended. So there was a lot of tension and a lot of anger, and I think people kind of knew what was going to happen beforehand.
Now, you were not a student at Kent State, but you were visiting for a couple of weeks. Why were you visiting at Kent State?
I had some good friends there, and they had informed me what they were going to be doing and asked if I would come, and I said sure. So there were a lot of kids that were from other places that were there. It wasn't just Kent State students.
Now, what were they going to be doing? What was getting protested? And you said there was numerous things getting protested,
Yes.
not just one thing.
Not just the Cambodia issue. That was the major issue. But overall, it was the Vietnam War and what we were doing. But there were several factions involved. It wasn't just a key element of let's be destructive and let's fight and argue and be drunk and those things. There were students that were really sincere and really wanted to put forth their efforts to be heard. And that didn't happen. It was really subsided, totally covered up because of the misbehavior of not just the students, but the faculty too.
Now, can you kind of take me through May 4th, 1970? What happened on that day? Like your daily routine, did you just get up and go outside and start protesting, or was it more of a relaxed, calm day?
No, far from calm, very far from calm. It was, most of us didn't sleep for 3 or 4 days because it really had started before that, about the 1st of May, even prior to that, some of the activities had. But that was a day of real anger, I would say, more than anything. I think most of the students lost the focus of their purpose because we weren't being heard, and because the powers that be decided that they needed reinforcement, physical reinforcement. And I think that was really what sparked it more than anything was, please just hear us, please let us say what we want to say. And that didn't happen. And there were also students that took advantage of being able to be destructive and riot and not represented as a really philosophical, well thought out program. We really couldn't do that. So it was full of tension, full of anger amongst the students also. A lot of tension between the students.
So what happened when the police started coming in? What were your feelings personally as being out there protesting? Did you ever think that people would end up getting killed as a result of the police coming in?
Probably. I think it was in the back of our minds. Not necessarily that it would happen, but that it certainly could. It was probably one of the few times in my life I've ever been speechless because I'd never really confronted something like that before, and most of us hadn't. So and I'm not sure I can even explain how it felt. It was almost like you were numb. Is this really happening? Are they really going to do this? And there was a lot of feedback between the students and the National Guard, and a lot of outsiders that were really provoking, that had no business being there, shouldn't even been allowed to be there. And the rock throwing, students did do that, but so did a lot of the outsiders do that. And so there were other people that were using this for their own purposes, and I think that's escalated a lot of it too.
Now, after the shots had been fired, what happened then? What took place? The kind of the turn events after that?
Everybody scattered and screamed, and there was return violence again. Some of the students did start attacking the National Guard, and some of them said, you know, we're going to go get our own weapons. So the reactions were multiple. Some just laid down and cried. Some sat down and cried. Some ran for cover. There was no organization, and I think that was part of the problem too. If that had really been better organized and the different factions had been together, it would have been done better. But that wasn't the way that it was. It sounds very minuscule to say scary. There isn't a better word. There was no control. There was you couldn't look to leadership. The faculty, the president of the university, no one was there really taking hold and controlling it, and that was the scariest part.
How did being there affect you? Affect the rest of your school year and things like that?
It helped me prioritize. I mean, I'd always enjoyed school and wanted to learn. So college was a priority. It was a gift for me. It wasn't a privilege. It was a gift. But it made me realize how important one person was, not because I did anything traumatic, but each one of us was one, and how one person doing something affects thousands and you don't even realize that. It also made me realize that it's important how you answer things that you disagree with. Violence isn't the answer, destruction isn't the answer, and how the mindset of groups really does take control. And if there isn't a strong leadership and a strong foundation of what you're really trying to accomplish, something is going to happen where people will get hurt, either mentally, physically, or emotionally.
And it kind of brings out, too, that no matter what's getting said, somebody needs to listen. Because like you said, the students were getting frustrated because nobody was listening and hearing what they were saying.
Absolutely.
How did staying at, well, Kent State closed for the rest of the year. So how did your friends react? Like you were visiting some close friends. How did it affect them?
Most of them were very, very angry. You know, they tried to approach President White and several other people and say, give us an opportunity. There were so-called committees that met. Again, the students really weren't heard because it was a few of those that were very, very destructive. And like any very difficult situation, you always go 360 degrees and then come back. And they came back too slowly, and they really didn't come back to 180. They didn't listen to the students and say, you know, give us another opportunity. Hear us, we'll hear you. Let us come back. We want to finish our education. They didn't see it as that, and they really refused. It was very, very politically done, very politically. Let's be sure that, you know, President White looks okay and other people look okay. So.
Yeah. We're going to kind of switch gears.
Okay.
Now, many people may not know you're a student at Buena Vista University. Now, what is it like being a student again as opposed to being a student in the 1960s and 70s?
Quite a challenge. Mentally, quite a challenge. My gray matter has changed a lot. Some benefits from it because I've lived all over the world and done lots of things, so my perspective is different. My need to learn is different. The attitude of students, of course, is much different. And that's been quite an adjustment, in all honesty. The priorities, I think, of kids are different today. It's easier for students to get into college, easier to be in school, and I honestly think that most of the students that I encounter don't really want to work for it. There are many that do. I'm certainly not categorizing, but I think today's society, it's, you know, give me the grade and let me do it, and that's all that I need rather than the thirst for learning. And that's kind of sad because 99% of students that I have met are bright and funny and intuitive and really have the ability, they're just not using it.
Now, you've talked about the differences of like the students today and tomorrow, or today and in the 1960s and 70s, but what are some of the differences that you've had to go through? Like a day of college in the 1970s compared to a day of college now?
Oh, much different. My focus was college, and I had a part-time job, a couple part-time jobs, so my focus really was college, and it was a focus then. It wasn't college and our party then college. It really was college and maybe a little partying. You know, I wasn't perfect. But it really was college and a part-time job. I think that's one of the major differences. I see the priorities today are not the same. It's almost like college today is an entity to partying rather than the other way around. And the expectations are different. They're more lax today in colleges. Whether that has to do with my being older and having lived so many places, I don't know. But it seems like the standards and expectations of students are less. And that is really disappointing. The professors I had way back then were very demanding and just did not take excuses. It didn't matter if you partied or worked or, you know, went home to feed your dog. It didn't matter. This was your job, was going to college. And I think that's one of the major differences I see today. Also, what I consider almost abuse of some professors that tend to use where they are in a college campus as their own personal platform. And certainly we did have the protests and professors that spoke out, and I think they have the right to do that. But we were taught to think, to look at all aspects and to come to our own opinion, not to hold necessarily the professor as an idol and whatever he says or she says is right. And I don't see that. I really see a lot of brainwashing. And I'm not speaking just of BV because I've been to a lot of other schools too. And that is sad because the kids are bright and have the ability to think, but teachers or professors often use it as their own personal platform. And I think that's unfair. I think that's a misuse of the kids' money for college.
Now, why, like you said, you have been, and I've had a couple classes with you, so
Yes.
I know some of your stories. We could do a whole show on
Yes,
those itself.
yes.
So why did you decide to come back to school? You said earlier you had a thirst for knowledge, but why now? What do you want to do in the next stage of your life?
I'm a divorced single parent, had my own business for 32 years, lived in Europe for 15, was very successful, set goals, accomplished all the goals. My son graduated from high school and I said, oh good, it's my turn. You know, I'm going to do what I want to do. I've decided what I want to be when I grow up. So I decided to go back to school. And I do want to go into clinical psychology. I'm not quite sure what aspect yet, but I do want to pursue and I will.
Oh, good. Now, do you think that being at Kent State at that time has really pushed you onward to do schooling, or is it just another thing that happened in your busy life?
Oh, absolutely not. It was very profound. It really did prioritize what I was going to do with every minute of my life. Because prior to that, you know, like all young people, you think, I'm going to live forever, or that can't happen to me if you have a car accident or whatever it is. Well, when it does happen to you and you go, whoops, you know, it really can happen to me. It makes you say, I may not be here tomorrow. I may not be here 20 minutes from now. So what I'm doing this moment, this day, is important. And that's really what I learned from Kent State, and that we are a ripple effect. You know, we're like one little stone that's thrown into the pond and the waves are there, whether we're one person or 1,000.
And even today, I think it's so important for students to realize what the history has been of our, of the country, of things like this that have happened and can really shape the community as well.
Yes, and not always just to listen to the so-called history, because there's so many misinterpretations. Not to take it just blanket that it was all bad or all good, because nothing is. You know, absolutely nothing is.
Well, Rebecca, thank you so much for
Certainly.
being
Thank
here and
you.
sharing your
Thank
stories.
you.
It was very interesting and
Thank you.
enlightening as well.
Thank you, I enjoyed it.
Great. As many people are starting to remember the anniversary of Kent State, it is important also to remember those who lost their lives and what we have learned from this tragic event. But as many people would say, all small towns look alike. But if you are from a small town, you know that's just not true. Focus is ready to challenge your small town skills with our segment called Where's Focus? Each week at the end of the show, we will show you a small town. If you can correctly identify the town, you can enter to win a prize. Here's this week's Mystery Town. To enter, mail your answer to Focus at BVU, Box 2545, in Storm Lake, Iowa 50588. Make sure to include your name and phone number. Each week, a winner will be chosen from all the correct entries. Well, that concludes this episode of Focus. I hope you have enjoyed it. Tune in each week as we talk to more local leaders about issues and events that affect you. Thanks for watching.
If you have any issues or events you would like to see on Focus, or if you have any questions, please contact us at the University Cable Network at 712-749-1218, or email us at innovationvideo@bvu.edu, or visit our website at iv.bvu.edu/focus. Focus is broadcast on the University Cable Network, a production of Innovation Video, a part of the Mass Communication program at Buena Vista University.